Chapter 29, Dictatorships in the Second World War, 1919 to 1945. So this is obviously the post-World War I era. So we're going to take a look first at the dictatorships that emerged following World War I with Hitler in Germany. You've got Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union, and of course Mussolini in Italy. And we're going to look at these different types of dictatorships, communism and fascism and totalitarianism, and the nationalism factor as well. And then we're going to look at the outbreak of World War II. So we're starting with authoritarian states, looking at conservative authoritarianism and radical totalitarian dictatorships. And these are different, so we could probably even put the versus thing there. The traditional form of non-democratic or anti-democratic government in European history was conservative authoritarianism. And in this type of government, the leaders rely on obedient bureaucracies to control society. The main difference between conservative authoritarianism and radical totalitarian dictatorships is that conservative authoritarians did not care to control every aspect of their subjects' lives. They mostly limited their demands to taxes, army recruits, and passive acceptance. After World War I, though, there was a shift in this, and there was a new type of radical dictatorship that emerged in the Soviet Union and in Germany, to some extent in Italy and in other countries. Fascist dictators took over Italy in 1922 and Germany in 1933, and by the time you get to World War II, you have fascist governments in Spain, Portugal, Austria, Hungary, and Romania. And some scholars have even used the term totalitarianism to describe this kind of radical dictatorship. They use violent political repression, intense propaganda in order to gain complete control and to make unprecedented total claims on the belief and behavior of their citizens. So this isn't just regulating taxes or demanding taxes and men for the army and acceptance. This is controlling every aspect of their citizens' lives and behavior. And so increasingly the state was trying to dominate the economic, the social, the intellectual, the cultural aspects of people's lives. And if you deviated from what they considered the norm, then it was a crime. And this came out of World War I and the total war that came forth in World War I, where state governments limited individual liberties and intervened in the economy to prepare their society for war. And another characteristic of this type of government is a charismatic leader. You've got Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, and they do not hesitate to use force and terror to intimidate and destroy any political opponent. So again, they censored the mass media, they instituted propaganda campaigns to advance their goals. They engaged in massive projects of state-controlled social engineering that really worked to replace individualism with a unified group of people who would be capable of exercising the collective will. So communism and fascism, and we could sort of do this again, the versus thing. We're looking really at the differences between the two. And certainly communism and fascism clearly share a desire to revolutionize the society and the state. But most scholars argue that the differences between them are more important than the few similarities. So after Marx, following Marx, the Soviet communists tried to create an international brotherhood of workers where class differences would disappear, everyone would be equal, they would make the same amount of money, they would have the same opportunities, and then this would of course result in a society free of capitalist inequality. And in pursuit of that goal, the Stalinist state nationalized private property, or the government took private property from the people. They pushed rapid industrialization, and they collectivized or controlled agriculture. And then you have leaders like Mussolini and Hitler who embrace fascism. And with fascism, the nation is the highest embodiment of the people. And they believe that they, themselves as a leader, the powerful leader, was supposedly the choice of the people. It was the materialization of the people's collective will. And so again, the state over the individual. Fascist governments did intervene in the economy, but unlike communist regimes, they didn't try to level out class differences. They didn't try to take everyone's private property. In the ideal fascist state, society would no longer be a battlefield of class versus class or individual self-interest versus another individual's self-interest, but rather everyone would work together and they would build a harmonious national community. Another difference between communism and fascism was over the question of race. Communists sought to build a new world around the destruction of class differences, not racial differences. Fascists typically wanted to build a new national community grounded in racial oneness or homogeneity. So many of these governments adopted the ideologies of eugenics. Eugenics is like a pseudoscience where they try to selectively breed human beings because they believe that if you could selectively breed them to look a certain way, then you could improve the general characteristics of the national population. So, the idea that Jews or gypsies or homosexuals or the mentally or physically disabled and any other person that they considered abnormal would contribute to the nation's racial stock was ridiculous. And according to these fascist leaders, they needed to be segregated or eliminated completely. And this is, of course, what led to the Holocaust during World War II, is the attempt to eliminate those kinds of people from the German race. So the Soviets did sometimes persecute specific ethnic groups, even though they were communists. And technically, communists are more concerned with eliminating class differences than racial differences. But the Soviets never attempted to destroy a group entirely. And in fact, communists denounced eugenics. Both fascists and communists did champion the revolutionary overthrow of existing society, but they were sworn enemies of each other. And the way that they would achieve that, or the revolutionary overthrow of society as it was very different. Historians to this day wrestle with the question of why so many people seem to approve of dictatorial rule. And it leads to even more questions. Primo Levi, who was an Italian Jewish chemist, writer, and Holocaust survivor, called this the gray zone. In other words, the gray zone of moral compromise that characterized everyday life in totalitarian societies. Stalin's Soviet Union, and we're starting with the transition from Lenin to Stalin. So by the spring of 1921, Lenin and the communist Bolsheviks had won the Russian Civil War, and it was time to implement this communist regime. But the problem was that they ruled a shattered and devastated land, and in the face of economic disintegration, riots by peasants and workers, Lenin ended up changing the course of this communist regime and replacing war communism with the New Economic Policy, or NEP. And this was basically temporary capitalism. The place was devastated, and he couldn't effectively collectivize agriculture or have government control of the agriculture without people starving in the process. And so the NEP basically reestablished limited economic freedom in an attempt to rebuild agriculture and industry before they implemented full-blown communism. So this was a political and economic success. It was necessary. but it was a temporary compromise with the Soviet Union's overwhelming peasant majority, and it allowed peasant producers to sell their surpluses in free markets to make some money. The NEP brought rapid economic recovery, and by 1926, industrial output surpassed and agricultural output was almost equal to pre-war levels. And so as the economy recovered and the government partially relaxed its censorship and repression, there was an intense power struggle going on in the inner circles of the Communist Party. And the two main contenders for control after Lenin died just 3 years later in 1924 were Joseph Stalin, who was a good organizer but not a great speaker, and then Leon Trotsky, who was a great and inspiring leader who had helped Lenin come to power. And even though it looked like Trotsky had all the advantages, Stalin triumphed because he was a better politician. He used his position as general secretary of the party's central committee as leverage to win friends and allies with jobs and promises once he became the next communist leader. He was also better able to relate Marxian teaching to Soviet realities in the 1920s. And he developed the theory of socialism in one country that was more appealing to the majority of communists than Trotsky's doctrine of permanent revolution. And so Stalin was willing to break with the NEP, the new economic policy, and build socialism. And this appealed to the young militants in the Communist Party who detested the NEP because it looked like capitalism. And so Stalin's triumph finally came in December 1927 when the party Congress condemned all deviation from the general party line. And so Stalin was then ready to launch the revolution and radically change the lives of millions of ordinary Russians. Trotsky, of course, fled to Mexico and mysteriously died, I think, by an ice pick. The 5-year plans. So the Party Congress of 1927 ratified Stalin's first Soviet 5-year plan, and this had staggering economic objectives. In just 5 years, the total industrial output was to increase by 250%, and agricultural production was projected to increase by 150%. And 1/5 of all peasants were scheduled to join government farms or socialist collective farms. And so there was this deep commitment to socialism and economic recovery that led to Stalin's second revolution. And he pressed for ever greater speed and sacrifice because he believed that economic development would allow the USSR to catch up with the West and also to overcome this traditional stigma of Russian backwardness. And so in 1929, Stalin ordered the collectivization of agriculture. And so this is basically, he forced the consolidation of individual peasant farms into a large state-controlled enterprise. Part of that was to prevent the peasants from embracing conservative capitalism, and part of it was to generate enormous sums needed for all-out industrialization. And so these increasingly repressive measures instituted by Stalin and his government focused on the kulaks. And this was a class of well-off Russian peasants, and they had benefited most from the NEP, the capitalist or the temporary capitalist policies of the NEP. And Stalin claimed that this right here, this group of people, was the enemy of progress. And that's who he targeted with the collectivization of agriculture. This collectivization led to chaos in the countryside as peasants resisted dramatically. They slaughtered their own animals, they burned their crops rather than turning them over to the state. And this was a cruel but real victory for Stalinists. And With that, the human cost was staggering. People died as a result of starvation from the government collecting agriculture or collectivizing agriculture. So many people died in this round of starvation. It was more than the total number of deaths in World War I. So by the end of 1938, 93% of peasant families had been herded onto these collective farms, and he pretty much effectively neutralized them as a political threat in doing so. They did manage to secure the right to cultivate tiny family plots, and so they did have some food of their own. In 1938, these plots produced about 22% of all Soviet agricultural produce on only 4% of cultivated land. So this successful, I guess, in Stalin's eyes, in that he was able to collectivize agriculture. Of course, a failure in the fact that so many people died in the process. The industrial side of his 5-year plan was much more successful. Soviet industry produced about 4 times as much in 1937 as it had in 1928. And so this forced industrial growth sort of went hand in hand with urban development. 25 million people migrated to the cities during the 1930s. And because the Soviets needed heavy machinery to build their communist future, an industrial labor force was created almost overnight as peasant men and women began working in steel mills, and plants. Workers usually had terrible living conditions. The industrial cities had been built hastily, almost overnight, in order to accommodate these workers migrating into the cities, but they did experience some benefits of upward mobility. So life and culture in Soviet society. What was it like to live there? So Stalin and his supporters had believed that once everything was owned by the state, then this utopian socialist society would emerge. And of course, that's not what happened. But they did build a new society that did have some good and lots of bad aspects. Because consumption was reduced in order to pay for investment, there was little improvement in the average standard of living. Collectivized peasants, or those who had been forced to work on these government farms, probably experienced the greatest declines in standard of living. Life was hard in Stalin's Soviet Union. Most people lived on black bread and they wore shabby old clothing. There was constant shortages. Housing was particularly a problem. And life was hard, but it wasn't completely hopeless. There was, an atmosphere of idealism and ideology that did have some real appeal for many communists. They saw themselves as heroes who were building the first socialist society. On a more practical level, there were workers, the Soviet workers did receive some social benefits. They got old age pensions, free medical services, free education, and daycare centers for children. The key to improving your position in life in the Soviet Union was to have specialized skills and a technical education. That was what was needed to increasingly grow the industry in the Soviet Union. And so Stalin actually broke away from the egalitarian policies of the 1920s and sort of dangled high salaries and special privileges before those who could gain technical or managerial skills. After the Russian Revolution in 1917, women began to gain some equality of rights as well. Divorce and abortion were made easily available in the 1920s, and women were actually encouraged to work outside the home. Now, after Stalin came to power, the Soviet Union did revoke some of the laws supporting women's emancipation, so that they could strengthen the traditional family and build up the state's population. But women did continue to work on farms and in factories and sometimes even in heavy construction. The Soviets also opened up higher education to women. Medicine became a profession that was open to women. Some of the sacrifices that Soviet society demanded from women, though, included the necessity of working outside the home. In some instances, they had to, and when they did, they received low wages. There was economic hardship. There were physical and emotional strains for those women who were working with like construction. The whole culture of the Soviet Union was politicized for propaganda and indoctrination purposes. Stalin actually ordered intellectuals to become, quote, engineers of human minds, end quote. And he instructed them to exalt the lives of ordinary workers and to glorify Russian nationalism. So we're actually going to stop there, and we'll pick up in the next video with Stalinist terror and the Great Purges.